Hi, my name is Ben Miller and I'm a physical therapist here at Total Physical Therapy, and today we're going to make another video that is designed specifically for new runners or people getting back into running. And today we're obviously going to be talking about shoes. As a new runner, it can be overwhelming with the amount of shoes and different types of shoes that there are out there. Lots of different technologies, lots of different makes and models, and it can be overwhelming at times to decide what shoe is right for me. Today is going to be a little guide on how to pick your first running shoe and what things you should be looking for in a running shoe. So to begin, we're going to talk about three different main components of a shoe, and we'll break it down and try to determine what types of things you should be looking for. So the three different parts of a shoe that are pretty much the main components are the bottom of the shoe, which we consider the outsole of a shoe. Then we have the part that you run on, the foam, which is what we call a midsole. And then we have the part that covers your foot, which is called the upper. These three components basically make up a running shoe. And we'll kind of break down these three different things and how you can look towards getting a shoe. So let's first talk about the outsole. The outsole of a shoe is designed very differently on different shoes. For example, some shoes don't include any rubber. They have just pure foam on the bottom and no rubber at all. Some shoes have lots of rubber, where if you look at the bottom of the shoe, it has a lot of rubber on the bottom. So what is best? It's a great question, and I think it depends on what you're wanting to do. If you live in a place that there's a lot of rain or there's a lot of puddles around and you could be running in a wet environment, then having more rubber is typically a little better because it'll help you prevent you from sliding around as much. I will say that if you go with a shoe without rubber, typically they tend to be a little bit lighter. This is definitely a lighter shoe than this one. And that's just because rubber adds weight. There are some shoes out there that have a hybrid. So if you look at the bottom of this shoe, there is exposed foam here on the bottom with some spots of rubber. And so the rubber is designed to help keep traction on the ground whenever there's wet environment, and then there's exposed foam here to make sure that it's help reducing how much rubber they're putting on the bottom of the shoe, just to try to help keep the weight down. So those are some things that you can think about whenever you're buying a shoe. If you live in a really wet area, I would suggest more rubber. If you live in a place that really doesn't get a lot of rain and doesn't get wet very often, then you can get away with having a shoe that doesn't have very much rubber on the bottom. Also with the outsole, if you're running on roads, then you probably want to pick an outsole that has a flat surface. Whereas if you're running on trails, or if you have a lot of trail systems nearby, you may want to consider getting something that has what we call lugs. So if you look at the bottom of this shoe, there are little grooves on the bottom that will help you grab the dirt a little bit better. And so you may be interested in getting something like that if you're interested in running a lot of trails. They do make shoes that are what they call an all-terrain shoe, where they have lugs on the bottom in some places. You can see those little lugs right there. So they have some lugs, but it's a fairly flat lug. It's not very aggressive. It's not very tall off the bottom of the shoe, so where you could easily run on it on roads if you needed to, but it can transition to a trail as long as it's not too technical of a trail. You can be able to transition to it fairly well. So those are some basic things to consider with the outsole. Let's move to the midsole. The midsole, again, is the part of the shoe that you run on. So it's this middle section here. The midsole is where we get most of the comfort from the shoe. We can get some of the comfort from the upper too, but most people, when they think about comfort of a shoe, they think about how squishy or how comfortable is my foot landing and hitting the ground. There are some shoes that don't have a whole lot of foam on the bottom of the shoe. This is what we refer to as a stack height. So how much foam do you actually have underneath your foot? So this would be a not very much stack height. And then we have shoes that have a lot of stack height, or really high stack height, where there's a lot of foam on the bottom. And it just depends on what you're looking for. Some people like the feeling like you're running on marshmallows. And this shoe does that really well. So if you like the feel of lots of cushion underneath your feet, and it feels like you're kind of moving into a lot of foam, then maybe a shoe like this will be a little bit better for you. But if you don't like that sensation a whole lot and you enjoy a little bit more firmness underneath your feet, then you may want to consider looking at something with a little less stack height. or even something like this that has a little bit less of a stack height than, say, a shoe like this. Now, within the midsole, within the different brands, there are different types of midsoles. Some are a little squishier than others. Not all midsoles are made the same. And so it's important whenever you're trying things out at a running store that you try on multiple shoes underneath your feet and you try to figure out which one feels comfortable for you. Now, I will say, and I don't have any shoes here, that there are different types of shoes, whether we call it a neutral shoe or a stability shoe. A neutral shoe are all the shoes that you see here. There's not a whole lot of fancy things going on in the foam. It's just one solid piece of foam underneath your foot. Now, there are such things called stability shoes, where if your foot has some problems where whenever you're running, your foot tends to roll inwards too much, they make a shoe where instead of having one flat piece of foam on the bottom, they actually increase the firmness of the foam on the inside part of your foot. And what that is designed to do is if you tend to run and you have a lot of rolling inwards as you run, that stiffer foam there will help prevent you from rolling in quite as much. Now, if you don't know if you do this or not, then it may be a good idea for you to get checked out by a professional and determine how much what we call pronation, or how much your foot rolls in. And you can get fitted to a shoe that will appropriately keep you from rolling inwards too much. We need to consider what we refer to as a heel-toe offset, or the drop of a shoe. What I mean by this is how much difference is there between the height of the foam here at the heel and the height of the foam here at the toes. And what this will do, the higher the drop or the higher the offset, the more foam you have underneath the heel and less foam you have under the toes. So it almost feels like your foot is coming forward, like you're being put into heels. And so I have a couple examples of this. So this shoe right here has what we refer to as a high drop. It has a 10 millimeter drop. So the difference between the foam here and the foam at the toes is 10 millimeters, so 1 centimeter. So your foot is forward a centimeter. And then we have shoes that go all the way down to no drop. This is what we refer to as a zero drop shoe, where the difference between the foam here and the foam at the toe is the same. So your foot is flat on the ground. Now, what is better? Well, it kind of depends on what is more comfortable for you. I will say, as a new runner, most people tend to walk around in shoes that have some sort of heel lift in it, and so, or that has some sort of offset. So it may be good for you to figure out, well, how much offset does your shoe that you walk around in right now, how much does it have? And typically, if you get a shoe that has that same offset, it will be a little bit better for you, or easier for you to get into running. Now, as you start running more and more and you want to kind of play around with different offsets from heel to toe, you can just make sure that you go about it very gently, because some people who go from a high offset like this to a low offset like this start getting into running injuries just because of the difference of how far your foot is forward in the shoe, or how far up your heel is compared to your toes. Okay, so let's talk about the upper of the shoe. So the upper is the part that contains your foot to the shoe, and there are a couple of things that you want to look for when it comes to the upper. Whenever you're trying the shoe for the first time and you're walking around the store in the shoe, you need to be looking for what we refer to as hot spots, or areas of the shoe that you feel that are rubbing on your foot. These can be problems because if you're out in a run, say you're running up to 3 or 4 miles, and that spot of your foot rubs against that part of the shoe enough, it can cause blisters. And so most of my shoes here actually don't have any problems with hot spots, except for this one shoe. And the hot spots can be different for different people. Everyone's foot's a little bit different. So just because I have a hot spot in this shoe doesn't necessarily mean someone else will have a similar hot spot in this shoe. But for me, whenever I wore this shoe for the first probably 3 or 4 runs, I had a hot spot up here where this rubber is a little bit more dense, where it connects to the shoelace. And I felt it as my foot was in the shoe when we were running, that little spot would rub. And so what I would do to make sure it wouldn't give me a blister is I would actually put a Band-Aid on the top part of my foot right there, at least until the shoe started breaking in, to give it a chance to see if it would wear in. After about 40 miles or so in the shoe, that part of the rubber became a little bit more loose, and whenever I took the Band-Aid off, I didn't feel it rubbing anymore. But those are some types of things that you want to look for whenever you're buying a shoe. Also with the upper, you want to make sure that it encloses your foot and keeps it nice and snug in your shoe. Sometimes the upper will be too loose and you'll have to tie down your laces real tight to make sure it attaches your foot to the shoe and it's not too loose to where you're sliding around in the shoe. You want to make sure you get a good lockdown through the laces to keep your foot nice and snug in the shoe. If it slides around too much, again, we can get blisters and things like that. Okay, so those are some shoe basics whenever you're looking at different aspects of the shoe, whether it's the outsole of the shoe, the midsole of the shoe, or the upper. So now let's talk about, you're wearing your shoe for a while, and when should I get rid of my shoe, or how do I know when my shoe is too old and I need to buy a new one? Here are a couple of tips to help you with that. So the first tip that I would recommend is if you start noticing your midsole breaking down, which is this section of the shoe right through here. And how do you know if your midsole is breaking down? Well, I have a good example. Here is one of my old running shoes that I have, and whenever I look at the midsole, just looking at it, it looks fine. But if I notice when I start moving it around, so I take the shoe and I can easily bend it or flatten it like this, compared to a newer shoe of the same type, these are the same shoes, just different colors, this one is much firmer and harder to do that same motion with. And so because this one has been breaking down, it's getting really loose, I can easily move this upper, or I can easily move and bend this midsole. I know it's time for me to start getting a new shoe because the midsole originally was a little bit more firm and was holding its shape a lot better. So that's one test that you can do with the midsole. Another test that you can do with the midsole is by doing a squeeze test. So here's one of my older shoes. If I take my hand, stick it in the shoe, and I can feel how much pressure I'm pushing here, how much squishiness there is in the shoe. It is really firm. There is no bounce back to it. There's absolutely no cushion there left. It's just really firm. If I go to the side of the shoe where I don't typically run on, and it's a little bit squishier out there, that'll give you an idea of how much squishy it should be. And then you go towards the center of the shoe where I typically put a lot of force, and it is just packed in and really, really tight. So if you start noticing that your midsole is not rebounding or not cushioned anymore on the places where you're landing with your foot compared to other places in the shoe that are still squishy, then it may be a good idea to start getting a new running shoe. Another thing that you can really feel with these shoes is, especially in this shoe, is whenever I put my foot into this particular shoe, I notice that my foot sinks down in the middle and the sides are actually riding up on my foot. And so whenever I get that sensation in a shoe, I start thinking, okay, maybe it's time to start changing my shoe. Alright, another indicator that you might need to change shoes is your outsole wearing down. So for example, you're going to have rubber on your outsoles. This is another shoe that I've retired, rightfully so, because if you look at the rubber down here, it looks fairly fresh. But as you start getting up here, you notice that that rubber right here has weared away and it's disappeared. And that's because I've put a lot of miles in this shoe and that rubber is completely gone. And so once you start noticing that the outer part of your shoe is really wearing down and the rubber starts going away, it's probably a good indicator that it's time for you to switch a shoe. And then the last tip for changing shoes is actually looking at the upper. So remember we were talking about making sure we get a good lockdown through the upper of a shoe. This is another shoe that I've retired. This shoe, in order for me to get a good lockdown in the shoe, I really have to cinch down these laces to even get some sort of fit into the shoe. As we wear our shoes, the upper will stretch because we're running in it and there are forces going through the upper. So over time, this upper will start stretching and it won't be able to lock our foot down anymore. Once that foot is not able to get locked down properly, it starts sliding a bunch and causing blisters like we talked about earlier. So once you start feeling you get really loose, it's a good indicator that you might need to start switching shoes. That, as well as if you start noticing your toes poking out of the shoe, it may be a good idea to start switching shoes as well. Okay, so those are some tips to when you need to start switching out a shoe. And here are some tips whenever you're first buying a shoe, some things that you need to look out for. So the first one is that if you do find a shoe that you really enjoy, what I recommend is that you buy multiple pairs of that shoe. Most of my shoes, a lot of my shoes here, I've bought multiple pairs. So this shoe I really enjoy, so therefore I have another shoe to match it. This shoe was actually a shoe that I first started running in way back when. This is not a running shoe. This is actually a casual shoe. But it did the job for me for a good few months while I was getting introduced to running. It was fairly cheap. It did everything that I wanted it to, and because of that I actually bought a couple other pairs of shoes as well. I don't still run in these shoes now because I like a couple of different other things like higher stack heights and things like that, more cushion under the foot. But this did the job for me whenever I first started running. The last tip that I can give you is that the most expensive shoe is not always the best shoe. Remember, every foot is different. Your foot is going to be different than the person next to you. Every shoe is a little bit different. Every model is a little bit different. And so it's important for you to go to a store and try on different types of shoes to figure out what feels comfortable for you. What shoe, whenever you put it on, feels right for your foot. So another thing that I would recommend for new runners is that when you're out buying a shoe, that you don't buy something that is specifically for a certain task. For example, there are shoes that are specifically designed for racing, and there are some shoes that are designed for trails and things like that. And so when you're buying a shoe, especially as a new runner, it may be best for you to try something that is more variable. You can use it for a variety of different things. For example, a shoe like this can be used for running daily miles. If you wanted to race in it, you could probably race in it as a new runner. If you wanted to run on some easy trails and things like that, it's got good rubber on the bottom for you to do that, get some decent grip, but it doesn't have the lugs on it like some of these other shoes have, where they have those deep lugs on it to where you can still run on the roads and be fine. So if you buy something that's a little bit more versatile, it may just serve you well as a new runner rather than going and buying something that's specifically designed for racing. This shoe is designed specifically to go fast and to go fast for short distances. And so as a new runner, if you put a lot of miles into this shoe will wear down really quickly. I think this shoe has maybe 120 miles in it, and it's getting pretty close to the end of its life. But if you get a shoe like this that is more of a neutral trainer, I have probably close to about 400 miles in these shoes, and they're still going pretty strong. And so just as a new runner, it may be a good idea to get a shoe that is more versatile, that you can use it for multiple things. Alright, thank you guys for watching this video. If you guys like the video, go ahead and give us a thumbs up, and feel free to comment down below, and we'll see you guys on the next video.